John is a senior lecturer in anthropogenic geomaterials in the School of Geographical and Earth Sciences at the University of Glasgow. His interests lie in anthropogenic geoscience broadly, ranging from CO2 drawdown to pollution to more fundamental geology topics such as anthropogenic sediment turning into rock. And today, John's going to talk to us about how anthropogenic sediments turn into rocks. So I'll hand over to you.
Thanks very much, Catherine. I'm going to talk a bit about some case studies of understanding this kind of process of how various types of anthropogenic sediments, which have been deposited by humans and are often of human composition, have turned rapidly into rock, kind of very much linked to what Amanda's just talked about. I'm going to focus in a bit more on the kind of micro scale observations that we've made in terms of chemistry and mineralogy to really try and understand that process. So anthropogenic sediments, we've got a sense of it today. They're very varied. They can be natural rocks that we've just like churned up and moved around and deposited again, or they can be things that we've created entirely ourselves, for example, in furnaces. So Gavin mentioned it earlier, talk about metallurgical slags. I'm going to focus in on a couple of case studies on a different type of slag, which is ferrous slag. So slag byproduct from smelting rocks to make iron and or steel. So this is a very voluminous type of anthropogenic sediment. Estimates vary, anything from maybe 500 million to 2 billion tons of this iron and steel slag produced around the world every year. The map on this slide gives us a sense of the diversity of locations where iron and steel is being produced, and therefore the byproduct slag is being produced as well. That's an annual estimate, 0.5 to 2 billion tons, so that's every year these days, but we've been making iron for a very long time, and so there's a really kind of unquantified amount of ferrous slag out there that we just don't really know quite how much. We've got estimates for the UK, about 160 million cubic meters of what are called legacy, old iron and steel slag produced up until very recent times, the last few years. Question though is, what happens to this slag when it's created? I've got a sense from Amanda's talk there. Some of it gets reused for use in construction or in aggregates, but much of it is just dumped in heaps in a kind of perhaps a sediment-like form somewhere on the land surface or maybe even at sea. Now, I'm going to focus in on this ferrous slag for the first couple of case studies because of its alkaline composition. It's rich in elements like calcium. And what we've really observed is that kind of chemistry lends itself to a process that geologists would call lithification. So we're turning sediment into a rock or an anthropogenic rock, exactly what we call it. Can maybe debate that a bit more. So I'm going to launch into a couple of case studies. The first one is from a site just near where we are in Glasgow, up in Scotland. And the photograph in the left, just kind of key ourselves in, we can see there's a sort of a lake, it's a freshwater loch there, bit of vegetation on the right, and then we've got this sort of zone in the middle of a kind of rocky shore-like material. The middle image on this slide is a bit of a close-up of that, and we can see it's got a sort of rough texture to it. You can see what appear to be clasts or particles. But actually, when you kind of looked at it a bit more closely, it's quite hard to pick those out quite so clearly individually. They almost look sort of fused together a bit with this sort of creamy coloured coating that's on them. And then I guess where my kind of specialism and interest lies is then actually going in really close, using some higher-powered electron microscopes to really try and understand what's going on in this material. So in the panel on the right, we've got, this is a false colour image from an electron microscope. You can see the sort of field of view of that image on the right is about 1 millimeter across or something like that. And what can we see here? Well, we can see there's sort of zones in that image where the sort of kind of blotchy texture of different colors. So up towards the top left, we can see some blues and greens and then a kind of orangey color in between them. And that's essentially a fairly typical composition of slag, or fresh slag we might call it. So a bit like what it is when it's first produced and cooled from the lava and becomes solid. But then as we kind of move a bit more away from the bottom, from the top left corner across that white dashed line, you can see the orange colors maybe replaced by a more purple color. And in this sort of color scheme in this false color image, that's telling us there's not so much calcium there. And we can see that, there's a sort of obvious part of a large particle up in the top left of that image, but we can see with sort of other patches of kind of blotchy color across this image, we've got various particles. And then there's this sort of network of that solid orange color that's sort of linking them all together. And this orange, that tells us there's lots of calcium there. And this is a mineral called calcite, or calcium carbonate. And essentially, we've got this texture where we've got these particles of slag that are sort of bound together by this mineral, calcite. Then let's go to another case study, this time from the north of England. And we can see a photograph on the left here from the field of some of this sediment deposit. We can kind of, even from a distance here, get a sense that that's a sediment. You can see the sort of patches of different colors there, sort of granular-like texture. Can even see some kind of sedimentary layering in that, perhaps, from when it was deposited by humans. On the right, we've got another one of these false color electron microscope images showing a kind of similar kind of overall texture. We've got these particles indicated by the sort of purple and pink class. They're the bits of slag. But again, they're kind of linked together by this network of the sort of orange color. Again, that's calcium rich. That's our calcite, calcium carbonate cement. So both of these examples then, which we've published on, you can see the QR codes on the slides, and I think Catherine's putting links in the chat. In both of these examples, we've got a sediment made of clasts or particles of slag that, since it's been deposited, has been bound together by this calcite cement. So that's a couple of examples from slag. But I want to throw in a couple of other case studies that we've been working on sort of similar-ish materials, again, anthropogenically deposited sediment. This one is another example of where the sediment is the material is created by humans. In this case, it's cement, or kind of waste cement clinker. So when you're making cement, there's various stages in the production, and at this site of a former cement works just outside Glasgow, for some reason, at the sort of cement clinker stage, that comes just kind of before you grind and mill the stuff down to a powder that you then can buy in a bag from the shop. That seems to have been, I don't know, failed some kind of quality control thing, and it was just deposited, dumped out the back of the works. So we've got a selection of field photographs here. We can see there's some kind of maybe sedimentary layering down in the bottom two panels. So again, it's got quite a granular texture. We get a sense of that from the photo in panel B. So again, this is a sediment that's been deposited. And a bit like slag, this kind of cement-like material is rich in calcium. It's got a kind of similar chemical composition. And if we go to the microscope, we can again see evidence of that being lithified. So those particles of sediment are being bound together. So the suite of images on the right are actually from a light microscope. The key thing here is we can see there's sort of areas of a sort of cloudy grey colour, and then there's almost like a network of a sort of brighter, more sort of yellowish colour, almost like fringing or rimming those particles, but also then joining the different particles of cement waste material together. Panel on the left, we've got another of these scanning electron microscope sets of images. If we just kind of focus on panel D in the left figure, again, that's similar to the two that I showed on the previous two slides. Again, we've got this sort of purplish color indicating where the cement waste product was. And again, you've got this kind of network of this fringing or rimming indicated by the orange color. That's this, again, one of these calcite cements that's binding this sediment together and essentially into rock. A slightly different but kind of similar example is an example we've been working on from Canada, which is mine tailings at a former asbestos mine. So Gavin mentioned tailings, kind of processed but natural rock which has been processed to extract the ore. This tailings material, again, it's a sediment, it's been deposited, it goes into big lagoons where it's kind of stockpiled. But again, depending on maybe the composition, This asbestos tailings are particularly rich in magnesium, which kind of chemically behaves kind of similarly to calcium. That was the element that was rich in the slag and the cement. Here we've got lots of magnesium. But in the photograph on the left, you can see that quite hard to see actually, the sort of darker grey fragments are the actual tailings, the original material that was then dumped after that rock had been processed. And it's almost been sort of dwarfed or kind of hidden in a way by the amount of new mineral that's formed on it in this kind of paler grey, more creamy colour. And again, we can go to the electron microscope. We've got a different colour scheme here because we're looking at some slightly different elements. The panel on the right, we can see there's various particles of sediment. You can see the shapes of those. They're in a slightly more greenish colour, maybe some of the red ones or the sort of beige coloured one to the top. But the key thing again is the colours maybe slightly harder to differentiate. But what we have is a sort of network of a slightly more greeny blue coloured material, which is filling in the gaps which are more obvious particles, which are the sediment in the tailings. This is a magnesium-rich system. The minerals which are forming a cement that are binding the tailings particles together are magnesium carbonates or hydrated magnesium carbonates rather than the calcium carbonates we saw in the previous example. These are minerals called nescaholonite and hydromagnesite. But again, we're seeing the same kind of texture, even though this is not necessarily a material that humans have created in a furnace. So it's just some kind of processed natural rock. We're seeing the same kind of cementation and lithification process happening. So to kind of bring all that together, I'm going to go back to thinking about slag in this sort of summary figure, and where we've got 4 panels, just kind of to tell the story of what we think is actually going on in this lithification process. So this is kind of based on the very first of the case studies that I showed in this talk. So we've got some particles of slag, and they're sitting in water, and that's the key thing, and then they react together. So we see around the edges of the particles of slag, we're losing or leaching out elements like calcium. And we can kind of see some evidence from that in the electron microscope data. Now, when that calcium leaches out into the water, little bits of water that are in between the particles, they then become quite alkaline in their composition. And due to various sort of chemical factors, that then causes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere to be sucked in to that water. And you've then got, in the water, you've got calcium in solution. You've also got dissolved CO2. The calcium and CO2 react together, and you form a new mineral. So you're replacing the water that was in between the particles of slag with a new mineral solid, in this case, calcium carbonate or calcite. And so that's our agent or our cement that's binding those previously loose sediment particles together to make them into a rock. So that's kind of fundamental science, really, of what we've been doing in our work in this area. I guess just kind of when we think about, why is this important? I mean, Amanda mentioned in her talk there around kind of ground stabilization. Maybe there's something we can harness this process in a way in a coastal setting, but maybe also rivers or lakes in terms of the change in hydrodynamics, the effect of waves, for example, on coasts when we have this process happening. But various other things to do with potentially, this process draws in CO2 from the atmosphere, which is good, maybe not in a massively big way, but every little helps. Similarly, we've got some evidence to suggest that when minerals like calcite form in between the slags, they can actually then capture any more kind of toxic metals that might be in the slag, capture them in that newly crystalline cement mineral that's forming, stopping those more toxic metals, things like chromium and vanadium, from getting out into the wider environment and maybe harming biodiversity. Again, I think worth mentioning, we had an interesting discussion in the chat earlier about what is a rock. Again, maybe this sort of starts to perhaps question that. I'd like to think maybe this is slightly more clear cut than if you've got plastic involved, but really interesting thing to discuss further. That's me. Thanks very much.